Hello, ladies and gentlemen. This is the lecture Modern International Macroeconomics. We will take a closer look at many interesting analytical aspects, including the coronavirus shock, which has created a world recession. So that's a big challenge. Of course, we cover also the more traditional ground and many interesting aspects. So I will switch now to the PowerPoint presentation. And here we are. So this here is then the first slide. It points out that this goes back as a lecture actually to a previous approach developed at Sciences Po in Paris when I was teaching there. And of course, we have the most recent updates here. So I also recommend that actually you take a closer look at the new paper, Macroeconomics and Healthcare Aspects of the Coronavirus Epidemic, EU, US, and Global Perspective, has just been published in the journal International Economics and Economic Policy, issue 2, 2020. There's an extra PowerPoint set slides for this. You could also take a closer look at US macro policy aspects under President Trump. So there's the Berkeley talk of January 26, where I have presented the book, The Global Trump. So I can also recommend the webinar of Professor Wieland. Actually, it's the MMCN webinar series on macroeconomic modeling and pandemics. And there are several very interesting presentations. So for instance, from Mr. Ulik and also from Werner Röger from the European Commission. I will come back to this later. So we will just switch here to the important disclaimer. So everybody should carefully read this. And it's basically about copyrights. And it's clear that the Q&A session is not recorded, but otherwise we have recording of this presentation. Yeah, we follow hopefully all the rules, and then we can take a brief look at macroeconomics as an analytical tool. So a good book which we can use as a background in international macroeconomics is Obstfeld-Rogoff Foundations of International Macroeconomics. It's very much a neoclassical perspective, but certainly it's useful in many ways to get the basic analytical background which we need. I would also emphasize, if we consider modern international macroeconomics, then we will not just consider an open economy with trade, but we must have an open economy with trade and capital flows, and particularly with foreign direct investment, which often is neglected in the literature. And I would argue that there is actually not a single textbook which covers foreign direct investment in an adequate way here. If we have foreign direct investment, we have to make a distinction between gross domestic product and gross national income. And I will come back to this distinction and the relevance later. So we also will look at US, EU, China perspectives. So this is a kind of a new world. We no longer have the famous sentence from many textbooks, assume we have a small open economy. Okay, occasionally we will consider such a setting, But the 21st century very much is a period of economic interdependency of big economic players. So we could also add, of course, Japan here or others. And interdependency in the world economy, that is not so easily understood by some of the policymakers, it seems. Well, obviously, one key aspect is that, let's say, the US adopts, for instance, under President Trump, a protectionist trade policy vis-a-vis China. Okay, this will have a negative effect on real GDP in China. But that, of course, in turn has a repercussion effect then on the US, because as GDP in China is declining, then Chinese imports are declining, and Chinese imports to a large extent are, of course, US exports, but actually also EU exports. So we then have really to consider this triangle. And on the other hand, I can point out that, for instance, there was an article for a report of the IMF a few years ago on China, which clearly said, okay, if China follows the recommendations of the IMF, then China's GDP will increase by a few points. But actually, per capita income in the rest of the world will also then increase by 100 euro, sorry, by $100. And okay, this is asymmetric across space in the sense that the relatively biggest gain would be for Japan and other countries which are actually close in a geographical sense to China. Yeah, it's very interesting and important to understand the logic of intertemporal choice. And here I think that the hoteling rule always is a good starting point. So now the hoteling rule confronts us with a decision making, let's say, of an oil sheikh who thinks, okay, how much oil should I produce in the current period, or alternatively, maybe I should leave oil in the ground and then produce in the future. So what then is the optimal production plan, and what can we learn from this? Yeah, well, it's always important in open economies to have a critical look at the current account, and this to some extent is linked to the life cycle tax policy also and other aspects. And President Trump in the US has complained for several years that the US trade account has a deficit which is much too high. And okay, this is the view of his administration, which I find a bit misleading. And actually, the current account of the US, which is the more relevant field of policy concern, if there is any concern, has not improved in the first presidency of Mr. Trump. Then there is the issue of economic inequality, and I must say that for a long time I was not so much interested in economic inequality aspects, but I must say that really the work of Atkins and Thomas Piketty and his group, they have shown that economic inequality aspects are important for macroeconomic developments. We will look into, let's say, uncertainty and risk aspects in international financial markets, and then focus on some aspects of economic growth, including aspects of endogenous growth, which explains innovation dynamics. And of course, we have to look at money and exchange rates under both fixed and flexible exchange rates. In reality, flexible exchange rates are a bit more relevant, but we have to understand both regimes. We then can look at the role of nominal price rigidities or other related aspects, imperfections in markets, let's say. And that brings us then to new Keynesian macroeconomics. So we have sticky price models, market imperfections, and in the practice of central bankers and also the European Commission, we would look at dynamic stochastic general equilibrium models. Finally, the coronavirus shock is certainly quite important because it brings about the first world recession. It's really a recession affecting almost all countries in the world economy. And in that respect, it's worse than the Great Depression of the 1930s. On the other hand, one should expect that economic recovery will be much faster than in the 1930s for various reasons where we can take a closer look at. But there are also, of course, very important economic policy challenges here. And some of them are immediately apparent if, for instance, we take a look at the IMF World Economic Outlook, April 2020, or if you read my Corona macro paper, or there's an interesting paper by Mr. Holtermüller from the German Research Institute, IWH in Halle, and there is a very interesting webinar, which I already have mentioned. Okay, we have a few required reading elements. So one is from the or one is looking at the Chinese economic statistics, and actually the question, how big is growth? And here's a conference board paper from the US, so frequently asked questions on the conference board's alternative China GDP series. It's not a long paper, but it's technically very interesting, I think. And then there is the Facundo Atkinson Piketty Size 2013 paper in the Journal of Economic Perspectives, the top 1% in international and historical perspectives. So this is about inequality. There are some EIW papers, one which I have written was Andre Jungwirthag. And this is actually about empirical aspects of innovation in the EU, and has also now been published as a journal paper. Yeah, it's interesting to look at macroeconomics after the Great Recession. There is an IMF economic review on this. There is a paper by Hendry in the Oxford Review of Economic Policy, which I think is very useful, 2017. And yeah, the IMF World Economic Outlook, I can really very much recommend, not just the 2020 spring edition. And yeah, the book, The Global Trump, deals with many international macroeconomic aspects. And there is a specific paper in the Journal of Economic Literature on New Keynesian economics, and we will see more on this later. Okay, the analytical basis is usually we have a certain modeling framework, we need some statistics, and we want to explain short and medium term output changes, and are interested to understand, okay, why do we have inflation or deflation in a system of fixed or flexible exchange rates? There are key policy issues, so how to overcome a recession, how to fight inflation, how to avoid deflation. And then there is the more long-term perspective, so long-run growth perspectives in an economy with trade and foreign direct investment. yeah, we are interested then also in the special aspects of international crisis. So not just an ordinary recession. No, there is then often a larger international economic crisis, and that concerns then the world depression in the early 1930s, the 2008-09 transatlantic banking crisis, often dubbed the Great Recession, and the 2020 Corona shock crisis. Okay, a few words on trade and FDI. If we are looking at trade, okay, everybody thinks naturally about specialization gains. In many sectors, there are also economies of scale. So exporting helps you to realize economies of scale more easily, and is about more innovation, including product cycle trade. And certainly in reality, trade in intermediate products is crucial. Roughly half of world trade is intermediate product trade. With product innovations, it's actually also quite interesting. And here the product cycle trade perspective of Vernon as a starting point. Here the idea is that product innovations are developed, let's say, typically in advanced OECD countries, let's say in the US, or maybe in Germany or Switzerland, or the Netherlands or France or Italy and so on. And yeah, could be also, of course, Japan, Korea. So if you have then product innovations in the tradable sector, then in the early stage of the product cycle, Vernon would then argue, is okay, we have the production, let's say, in the US, in country one. And then, of course, after a few weeks or months, exports will start. So the domestic market is served first, then come the exports to all countries in the world. And then in the second stage, we have a standardization stage where the product, but also the process of production becomes more standardized. And when it is more standardized, that means that the relocation then of production can start more easily. So you can then maybe relocate from the US to Western European countries or Eastern European countries. And that means that the US will start also to import the respective goods. So let's say a new mobile phone initially has contributed to improving the US trade balance and the current account respectively. Okay, later when the product is then increasingly imported from abroad, so if you are then in the standardization stage, then your current account or the trade balance will weaken. And in the third stage, when we are in the maturity stage and the price of the product has started to fall, and we have a very highly standardized production process, well, then the pressure is usually very high to relocate to some other countries, maybe countries in Asia where wages, or I should say unit labor costs, are rather low. And then both the US and the EU will start to import the respective good. So obviously, if a country has let's say a serious problem with the trade balance deficit, then the Vernon perspective would be to say, okay, there is not enough product innovation. If we would have more sectors with product innovation, we would naturally be in a better export position. So that's really interesting. And of course, foreign direct investment and the role of multinationals is important. So if we think about foreign direct investment flows, we have, of course, a capital formation effect if this is greenfield investment. And in all cases, even if you just have international mergers and acquisitions, that's more than half of world FDI transactions, then you have an international technology transfer effect. We might also witness certain market power problems if, for instance, big MNCs invest in relatively small open economies, unless these economies are part of a regional integration scheme. Yeah, and there is this necessary distinction between gross domestic product and gross national product. So the real GNP, which is denoted here by Z, that's simply the GDP denoted by capital Y plus net factor income from abroad. So yeah, if we want to simplify the model and disregard portfolio capital inflows and outflows for a second, then we would simply say, okay, this is all about profits from subsidiaries abroad. And then country one will get profit income. Actually, the parent company gets profits from its subsidiaries abroad. And on the other hand, okay, we, for instance, in Germany or in the US or in the Netherlands or in Switzerland, of course, we are also a host country for foreign direct investment. And that means we have subsidiaries of foreign multinationals in our country. And therefore, it is clear that there are also profits which will flow then to the foreign source country of foreign direct investment. And you can apply the same to China, Japan, and so many other countries. So net factor income from abroad would simply then be the two effects that you get profits accruing from the subsidiaries abroad, and you pay profits, you transfer profits as you have subsidiaries from foreign multinationals in the country. So, okay, maybe the net factor income just is about zero. So the profit effects on the accumulated inflow and outflow side kind of cancel out, but that is not always the case. And I think it's really important to make this distinction between GNP and GDP. It's actually also important to point out that many key economic functions, let's say the consumption function, of course, should read that consumption is not proportionate to disposable GDP, but of course to disposable national income, to disposable Z. And if there's foreign direct investment, of course, one has to consider this. And you can also, of course, take a look at export functions. Their export should be proportionate to foreign GNP, and imports are not proportionate to GDP. Typically, they are proportionate to national income in the importing country. Okay, we have some kind of classical views. So markets will create full employment, equilibrium, governments can set import tariffs and tax rates. We have then some government expenditures on schools, domestic security, the military, the infrastructure, the legal system, and maybe we have a balanced budget between 1880 and 1913. But the situation already looks very different in the United Kingdom than in the 1920s, when there was a long period of high unemployment rates. There was a lot of industrial action, there were strikes, and so on. The Keynesian view started to emerge, I would say, with this background of the 1920s in the UK. So Keynes was quite interested to understand what was happening in the 1920s. He was not just interested to understand the Great Depression. So a Keynesian view is then more a macro model with unemployment, so which is Keynes' general theory book of 1936. And we then focus more on expansionary fiscal policy and deficit spending. So government should fight recessions in a non-inflationary setting, and at least in the 1930s, inflation certainly was not a big problem. It became more of a problem in OECD countries in the course of the 1970s, when we also had the two big oil price shocks in 1973, 74, and 1979, 1980. Okay, so we are interested, I would say, here then in fiscal policy and monetary policy, fiscal policy in the recession associated with deficit spending. And as regards the inflation rate, okay, if we take a look at the inflation rate in a Keynesian perspective, we would start with a short-term Phillips curve, and then also in a neo-Keynesian perspective, take into account what Milton Friedman said. So there's a long-term vertical Phillips curve. And okay, if you look at the short run, then in the initial Keynesian Phillips curve, we have adaptive expectations. So economic agents are backward looking. And here the situation is, or the setting is really different in modern macroeconomics, because there economic agents are forward-looking. So yeah, the growth modeling and new Keynesian macroeconomics, so the abbreviation is NKM, and actually often then you will hear DSGE, dynamic stochastical general equilibrium models. Yeah, we have a few standard aspects here when it is when we discuss economic growth. So we have output as a function of capital, so which is K, of knowledge, which is capital A, and of labor, which is capital L. And we assume, okay, population and the workforce, that's the same. This is just a simplification, of course. We have a growth rate of knowledge, which is small a, and we have a growth rate of the population, and here the growth rate is denoted by small n. We have a depreciation, which is denoted by d prime or sometimes by delta. And the production function is simply Cobb-Douglas, so capital Y is k to the power beta, and then in brackets a times L to the power 1 minus beta. And then the kind of more long-run view in a Solow growth model, where we denote per capita income by small y, S is the savings rate, T double prime is the income tax rate, and E prime is the Euler number. Okay, then we can say that per capita income, small y, in the steady state is denoted by this pound sign, is equal to the initial level of knowledge, so this is a with this lowercase 0, times the savings rate times 1 minus the income tax rate, and then you divide by the sum of the technological progress rate, small a, plus the population growth rate, small n, plus the capital depreciation rate d prime, everything in brackets, and then to the power beta over 1 minus beta, and then you have to multiply also with the Euler number to the power at. So that means we have a certain growth rate, permanent growth rate in the steady state, which is determined simply by the exogenous growth rate of knowledge, so the small a. And we have the level of the growth path, and this is basically all the rest. And obviously then a higher savings rate is better than a lower savings rate. So if you have a high savings rate, that will bring about a fairly high level of the growth path. Okay, the role of the tax rate, that's obviously negative, but this is negative, I would say, only in this, or it's clearly negative only in this kind of simple setup, because we have not yet considered the question, are tax revenues used to finance innovations? And if that would be the case, then maybe the growth rate of knowledge would increase, and so on and so on. Okay, NKM, yeah, there we have these DSGE models used by all the leading central banks in the world economy. Dynamic means we have an accumulation of capital. Stochastic, okay, this is then obviously the stochastic environment, and we have some shocks and random elements and so on. General equilibrium means, okay, this is a model where you should have equilibrium in goods markets, in labor markets, in the foreign exchange market, and of course also in the bond market, so in the loan market. We usually have some micro foundation. Okay, we might have imperfect markets, so market imperfections, and then we have heterogeneous competition, so we have not just one good, but we have many different goods, and then we have markup pricing. Okay, if we have product differentiation, maybe we have some sectors where you have a big concentration on the supply side, and then the markup rates, of course, are rather high. And as I have already emphasized in the NKM models, we have forward-looking agents, and actually we have rational expectations. What does that mean? Following mood. This means that the economic agents will consider a model of the economy, so some simplified representation of the economy, and they will use this model actually as the basis for expectation formation. So that's not so interesting to look backwards and then say, okay, the past 3 years we had inflation rates of 1%, 3%, 5%, and maybe then this year we should expect 7%. No, this is adaptive expectations. Rational expectations would say just consider the model which we have, and then look at the solution of the model for the inflation rate, and okay, then this is the basis for intelligent expectation formation, so rational expectations. We are interested in various aspects of the equilibrium and also the dynamics of adjustment. At first, okay, is there an equilibrium? If there is an equilibrium now, and maybe after some policy intervention, a new equilibrium E2, okay, then we can compare within our comparative statics the initial equilibrium E1 and the new equilibrium E2. Maybe we are able to say a little bit about the adjustment dynamics. So how do we get from E1 to E2? is there, for instance, maybe some overshooting in foreign exchange markets, or is this just a smooth adjustment process in financial markets, in goods markets, in labor markets, and so on? And there are certain normative issues. For instance, there is in growth models, in neoclassical growth models, an old question: how can we have a choice of the capital intensity in the long run such that we can maximize per capita consumption in the steady state and thereby maximize economic welfare? So this would be the golden rule. And we can, for instance, take a look at various countries. Is the golden rule implemented, or yes or not? Okay, what is required in modern macroeconomics, I would say, is you want to explain the normal output changes, current account dynamics, unemployment, inflation, maybe the oil price. The oil price is a world market price. So then I would argue, okay, if we have a two-country model, and probably we will have to look at two big countries, then maybe we can explain the oil price. We can also consider, of course, deflation or the risk of deflation. We will have to explain international economic crisis. A crisis is something which is not simply a recession. Okay, a big recession, that would be an economic crisis. And there are not so many, I would say, important crises. So we are interested in the start and the diffusion, policy options, and actually the policies which were implemented. We would look at the Great Depression in the early 1930s. We could look at the Asian crisis. We could look at the Asian crisis in 1997, 1998, and we also, of course, can look then at the Great Recession, so the transatlantic banking crisis 2008-09, which was very serious and could have brought easily the next world recession, if not very strong and careful intervention, particularly by the central banks and also from fiscal policy side, would have been adopted. And 2020 was the Corona crisis. We don't know too much about this world recession in early spring, but we probably can say, if we believe then the world economic outlook of the IMF, this recession is going to be more serious than the transatlantic recession 2008-09. And then we would obviously say, okay, this is not just kind of a standard recession. It's a big challenge. Yeah, macroeconomic dynamics in a period of economic globalization. So we have globalization since the 1970s, since the 1980s. We have modern globalization because financial market liberalization was adopted in the 1970s in OECD countries and also some newly industrializing countries. And then since the mid-1980s, we have the liberalization of foreign direct investment. And as there was so much privatization around the world, also the asset menu became larger, certainly in OECD countries, but again, also in some newly industrializing countries. We have migration, we have the internet, so that affects price dynamics and the price level respectively. We have regional integration and, okay, in the context of Brexit, also disintegration. Okay, the trade account versus the current account, when we start looking here more at the open economy, Okay, a negative current account, that's important to understand, of course, means rising foreign indebtedness. And the question is always, how big is your foreign debt relative to GDP or GNP? And one interesting question, of course, is how can one correct current account imbalances if such imbalances are too big or a case of concern? So you might point then to the role of the respective surplus country, let's say Germany or China, or maybe also Switzerland or OPEC countries. Or you can say, listen, if there is a current account deficit, then the deficit countries should take care of this, and they should introduce certain measures. So let's say in the US and the UK, they would be expected to adopt adequate policies which would remedy the excessive current account deficits. Yeah, that's in any case a coordination problem, because let's say, for instance, if the US would say, yeah, we have a big current account deficit, which is too big, as President Trump emphasizes, then, okay, the US administration could argue this is not our problem. Yeah, this is rather the problem of Germany and China, while Germany and China might adopt the position, no, this is not our problem. Obviously, the US has to adjust economic policy, should increase taxes, should stimulate savings, and so on. Okay, one problem can occur if you have a big current account deficit over many years and you are then already strongly indebted abroad. So if foreign institutional investors lose confidence in the respective country, say because the rating has worsened, is no longer investor grade, so would be below triple B minus when you look at Fitch ratings, for instance. So what you can then have is what we call a sudden stop, that all the capital inflows all of a sudden stop. You will no longer get any capital inflows. Rather, capital starts to flow out very quickly and dramatically. And that was, for instance, the case in Greece in 2010 when we had the euro crisis. Yeah, this can be a very serious challenge. And as you may know, Greece was then stabilized through some bilateral loans from its EU partner countries, or I should say from EU and Eurozone partner countries. It was not just Greece which was facing this crisis in 2010. There was also Portugal, there was Ireland, later there was Cyprus, Spain to some extent, and so on. Okay, the government budget constraint has to be considered. That's, I think, an interesting equation where one often sees only income tax revenue on the revenue side. But now we have also value-added taxation, and I think in Europe, in China, in many other countries, we have VAT rates, so that has to be also considered. And of course, the budget constraint will show us if there is a deficit GDP ratio, which is positive. And typically, of course, then in a recession, this deficit GDP ratio will rise. In 2020, I'm afraid we will see some dramatic increases in Italy, in the US, and in some other countries. Okay, firms and households, they face budget constraints, of course, for the current period, and there's also some intertemporal budget constraint. Now, if we look at economic openness, that's really interesting. So here we have a graph from 1960 to 2007. And yeah, we made this graph on the basis of data from the World Bank. And what you can see here is the share of exports of goods and services as a percentage of GDP. And we have in black the US, we have China in red. And as you can see, so China opened up in 1978, and then it started really to strongly increase this openness, measured here as export of goods and services as a percentage of GDP. Okay, the euro area, as you can see in blue, is even higher than the degree of openness in China. In China, we have seen a peak, I would say 2006, already before the Lehman Brothers shock or the transatlantic banking crisis. And now China's exports have reduced, of course, only relative to a quickly growing GDP. And for the whole world, you see then the kind of bar diagram information. Okay, for the whole world, it seems that we have had a very long increase in trade openness, and recently we see some stagnation and even a small reduction of the degree of openness. Okay, let's explain changes in the real economy. Then we talk about output, the real gross national product, as I emphasized, GNP. Unemployment rate, important, consumption, interesting, investment, government expenditures. Okay, is this G, real government expenditures, is this really exogenous? Yeah, we often assume it is exogenous, and that's fine for many model settings. We consider exports of goods and services, imports of goods and services, and then we typically are interested in the capital intensity, small k, which is k over L, and per capita income, which is small y, which is capital Y over L, and A, capital A is knowledge. Okay, and then the monetary economy, then we talk more about the exchange rate. So nominal exchange rate is denoted by E, the price level, so a capital P, or the inflation rate, which is DLNP over DT. So the stock market price, which is denoted here by P prime, the nominal interest rate, which is denoted by small I, the real interest rate, which is small r, the price of non-renewable resources. I have denoted this here by capital P double prime, and then there's the real exchange rate, which in a way has, of course, a link to the real economy. So the real exchange rate, as it is defined here, is small q star, and this is equal to the exchange rate times the foreign price level P star divided by the domestic price level, capital P. It's very important to understand how economic systems and macro markets work, and to some extent we will need a micro foundation to better understand how the logic of economic adjustment works. Capital accumulation dynamics, that's very important. Okay, to some extent, of course, also knowledge accumulation, but the standard starting point is always capital accumulation. We have financial market dynamics where you can have risk premiums, in the sense that risk premiums can occur across countries. So let's say, rating, and that means then the probability of default is considered to be maybe relatively high in country B, while country A has AAA rating and a probability of bankruptcy in the perception of markets, let's say, close to 0. And then, of course, there will be risk premiums in the sense that country B will have to pay higher interest rates. You can also have risk premiums in the sense that you compare the interest rate which is offered, let's say, for corporate bonds by AAA rated companies, and then you compare with government bonds, assuming that government has also AAA rating, and one can learn, of course, a lot from changes then in these risk premiums. Can be international risk premiums, can be risk premiums, as I said, for the corporate sector within a country. Okay, there are certain policy issues, and I would say mainly concerning monetary policy in country 1 and 2, fiscal policy in country 1 and 2, and on the other hand also innovation and what is fairly new, health policy, where we can, for instance, compare the US and the EU. Yeah, when we look at just a few aspects of health, because that's not so obvious that health and macro go together. Okay, the first thing which we can observe, and I'm referring here to this Corona macro paper, which I've published in the Journal of International Economics and Economic Policy. So in the journal International Economics and Economic Policy, issue 2, 2020, you can find the details, but let's start with a simple observation. So the health expenditure GDP ratio is 18% in the US, it's 12% in Germany and France, it's much lower in Western Europe, as you can see, than in the US. On the other hand, life expectancy in Germany and France is actually higher than in the US. Infant mortality in Western Europe is lower than in the US. And obviously, health insurance coverage in the EU is broader than in the United States. Well, I think that health insurance coverage is a good proxy for the average health status of workers. And therefore, I've written here a macro production function, which is a slide modification to what we have normally in textbooks. So here we have k to the power beta, that's standard, and then we have this bracket term. So L times A is usually dubbed labor inefficiency units, but here we have multiplied it also with small h to the power beta prime, and h is health insurance coverage, or we could say a proxy for health, for the health status of the representative worker. Okay, it's small h to the power beta prime, and we assume here that we have achieved a health insurance coverage ratio which is such that h to the power beta prime exceeds unity. So that means the health element, so to speak, raises output. Okay, health insurance coverage could actually have also a dampening demographic effect on an epidemic shock. So normally we have an exogenous growth rate of the population, small n, but here I'm using an equation which says that small n is some exogenous parameter, small n prime, and then times, in brackets, 1 minus C double prime. C double prime is this epidemic shock parameter, and then we have multiplied with 1 minus small h double prime, which is a positive parameter, times h. So this means that, okay, if there is a corona shock, if there's the flu season, if you have an infection wave, okay, then this will dampen the growth rate of the population. But if the health system is organized fairly well, and that should be the case if you have broad health insurance coverage, then this dampening effect on dampening effect of the epidemic on population growth will be mitigated by the health insurance coverage ratio, small h. Okay, the pandemic, the coronavirus 2020, that's a very serious problem. It undermines certainly international production change. We have seen that international shipping of goods and certainly also of intermediate products became more difficult, and even in the European Union, where we have an EU single market, we have seen problems that all of a sudden we have border controls and trucks have to wait for a day or more, while in 2019 they would not even stop at the border. You would not notice that there is a border when you talk about transportation of goods and services within the EU. Okay, if you have a less reliable import of intermediate products, then this undermines the international production change, and we can say obviously this amounts in economic terms to a higher capital depreciation rate, because if you do not have certain imported intermediate products which you normally would use, then part of your machinery and equipment actually cannot be used. And okay, if the capital depreciation rate is rising, this will reduce the level of the growth path. Yeah, the health insurance coverage ratio H could actually affect the savings rate. We would normally think it will reduce the savings rate if there's then a national health insurance system. If you have no national health insurance system, then many people, if they can afford this, they will want to have high savings for the day when they fall ill, because then they will face bills from the hospital, from the doctors, which have to be paid. Okay, age could, small h could positively affect the growth rate of knowledge, because those studying will not have to interrupt higher education if parents fall ill. So actually the number of researchers might rise due to broader health insurance coverage. And then you see this here in the equation, where the growth rate of knowledge, small a, is written as an exogenous term, a prime, plus a positive parameter, a double prime, times h. So this is at least part of the aspects. These are some of the aspects which one should consider, I think, in this corona recession, in this corona world recession. Here we have some data just on output growth, and the obvious point here is that we have a very strong correlation of output growth developments in recent years. Okay, the red line for emerging and developing Asia doesn't show a very strong recession effect in 2009, but okay, there is some recession effect, and then all other areas and country groups, they all faced a strong recession in 2009, just a year after the bankruptcy of Lehman Brothers on September 15th in the year 2008 in New York. Yeah, we have some other interesting factors. So, for instance, declining productivity growth since about 2000. There is an IMF working paper on this, which argues that there is strong aging of workforce in many OECD countries, and particularly Germany, Italy, Spain, Portugal, Greece after 2025. Also, already earlier in Japan. There is then the problem of pensions and pension reforms, because if you have a higher share of retired of the retired population, of the retired workforce, then you have somehow to find a solution. The question is, what are the effects on the savings rate, the government budget deficit? What are the effects maybe in this trade-off debate, higher pensions versus higher education budgets? So basically, the aging of the labor force lets us expect that we will see a slowdown of productivity, because the older workers find it more difficult to learn new things. Okay, maybe that retraining is not really adequate, but this is a demographic challenge for, I would say, for Europe. A little bit less for France and the UK than for the countries mentioned here. Yeah, it's interesting, and it's also interesting to read this study, which then looks also at productivity by age for various professions, and there are only two professions where productivity is not declining with age, and one group is physicians, so experience matters, and the other is actually professors. Whether that is true or not, maybe that's not so clear, but of course, it is an interesting and important challenge when we think about medium and long-term growth perspectives. Aging problems in France and UK not so strong. Question about immigration pressure. What are the benefits? What are the costs? We can clearly say that the UK, for instance, is a winner in terms of net budget effects, of net government budget revenue effects from immigration. And there are very few countries, Germany is one of them, where immigration creates here for the government budget a negative net effect. Okay, here we have some projected workforce aging in selected European countries, and this here is then from an OECD study. And one can clearly see that the percent of share of workers aged 55 to 64 years in the labor force. This is all in red territory after 2020, for instance, in Germany. So that means the share will exceed 20%. Luxembourg, which has a lot of immigration, that's all in the green field, so smaller than 15%. And as we can see, as of 2025, then more and more EU countries, including Italy and Spain, will have a rather high share of elderly workers. And as you see here from the source, this is an IMF working paper. So let's look briefly at some figures. So world output of all countries together, and then China, US, EU, and so on. So we should look at real GDP, and often it's useful if you want to compare countries to look at purchasing power parity figures. 2015, China then was for the first time ahead of the US and the EU. China has 1.4 billion inhabitants, the US 330 million, EU 28 is 510 million. The global total is a little bit more than 7 billion, and we have this triad interdependency. And I've already mentioned, this point about the Article 4 report of the IMF 2014, where it was argued, okay, if China adopts the reforms suggested, that's good for China, but it also increases or brings a per capita income gain of $100 for everybody else in the world economy. And that's interesting. Okay, the conference board is a bit skeptical about some of the Chinese official statistics. It says China will have 16% of, or does have 16% of the world economy, and only in 2025 its share will be higher than that of the US GDP. So then in 2025, China would have 18% of world GDP, and the growth rates and the GDP figures in the conference board database is somewhat smaller than official figures. The conference board says the 5-year growth trend in China is 4.5%, and for instance, China 2015 3.8%. The official figure was 6.9%. Here you can see what I said before about the immigration link to the government budget. So we have net budget revenue effects, and we have very few countries. When you look just at the effect of immigration, which is the blue bar, you see you have a surplus effect for the government budget almost everywhere. In Ireland, France, and the Slovak Republic, there is a small negative effect, and the negative effect is a bit larger than in Germany and Poland. So why does, for instance, the UK have a positive government budget effect? Well, this is simply because immigrants work. Their participation ratio on the labor market is actually higher than that of domestic residents, in the sense of British workers. And they're also relatively young, and if they are relatively young, so if their average or median age is below that of the British population, well, that means they will require less, for instance, healthcare expenditures from the national health system than the average British worker. The point here is that most of the healthcare expenditures over the whole life occurs when one is older. So if you are above 50 or 60 or maybe even 70, And in the US, for instance, roughly 1/3 of healthcare expenditures will occur in the last 2 years of life. Okay, with the coronavirus epidemic, we have an interesting analytical challenge. It all started in China in December 2019 with this coronavirus epidemic. The death rate among the infected is 1 to 3% in China and the OECD. In the Chinese province Hubei and also some neighboring provinces, already in January and February, there was a shutdown of firms. There was a lockdown in the first quarter. And through this kind of quarantine policy, they brought the virus under control. And yeah, the number of case fatalities has then dramatically reduced in China. Then in late March and April 2020, we have done similar problems in the EU and the US, and already the end of the first quarter was really difficult because in March we have started in Europe and in the US with shutdown of firms, lockdown measures, so stay at home requirements for part of the workforce. And the second quarter of 2020 probably is going to be very difficult because then the peak probably of the case fatalities will occur, and only after one has made some progress in bringing down the growth rate of infections, one can then kind of restart the economy, and that will occur only in the second quarter, and maybe then we have economic growth again in the third and fourth quarter of 2020. Okay, so I was looking in this paper, which I have mentioned in the EIW working paper 270 and 272, then at the role of international tourism. I was assuming this would decline by 50%, and if you just look at this single sector, which of course is important in certain countries, this brings then output reductions between 1% and 9% in 2020. So this can be really can be dramatic, and actually even minus 5% as an aggregate effect, for instance, in Portugal and Greece will be difficult to digest. Yeah, 9%, which also is the order of magnitude for Croatia, a little bit less, but it's very high. So this is just tourism, and of course manufacturing industry, construction, and so on. That all comes on top. So there is an interesting role of health insurance coverage ratio, as I have mentioned. More healthy workers means you have a higher labor input. This is a positive supply side effect. And it's good for the production potential. On the other hand, if you have a high share of infected people who all have to stay home, or maybe they are in hospital, or they might even die, then of course this has a negative effect on the effective labor input. Okay, the 4 key effects which we have is we have a negative output shock in China. Yeah, because China was the first country where the coronavirus epidemic was observed, and through the lockdown and shutdown measures, then of course also psychological effects on the demand side. There was a clear negative output shock in China, and this has a negative effect on the exports then of Japan, of Korea, the US, of EU countries, and of many other exporters to China. So if China's GDP, its national income, declines due to the corona shock, then it will import less, and this has a negative mirror effect, of course, on the exports of so many countries. And do not forget that China is really a big economy. So in 2003, when we had the SARS epidemic, China was representing just 4% of world GDP. Now it's 16%. Okay, there's a negative supply shock in OECD countries. There is this problem with the imports of intermediate products. That is a negative supply effect. And I think it will be relatively strong in the tradable sector. There's a negative demand shock in the whole economy, affecting both the tradables and the non-tradable sector. So unemployment is rising. So in the US, and within about 8 weeks, that means in March and April, the number of unemployed has increased by almost 30 million. This is enormous. In Europe, the situation is a bit better. We have, on the other hand, a different institutional setting. So for instance, in Germany, we keep people in companies, pay them only roughly 2/3 of their wage, and this way we can be ready for a quick economic recovery if this recovery then indeed is occurring, hopefully. Okay, the negative demand shock, unemployment rising, fear of unemployment, the self-employed face particular problems, and in many companies, certainly in hotels and restaurants also, we have a liquidity shock. You have to pay monthly rents, you have to pay your workers, and so on, but there's no revenue, or very modest revenue, and then you have a liquidity shock, and here government policy helps, and actually should help. Here we have some figures from the World Economic Outlook, April 2020, and we just see here, so the projections for Europe, minus 6.6% growth rate in 2020, Eurozone minus 7.5%, China roughly plus 1% instead of 6%, which they had in 2019. Asia goes from 4.6% to 0%, and the US from 2.3% in 2019 to an expected minus 6%, we may say, in 2020. The good news is that, well, the IMF expects that in 2021 that there will be a strong economic recovery with growth rates of about 5%, in China even 9%. Unemployment figures, that's not so dramatic. There is, of course, an increase visible here, and it's a very strong increase in the US from 3.7% 2019 to 10.4%. But then 2021, the unemployment rates will increase, will decrease, and as regards the current account, the situation is not changing very dramatically. There is somehow a decline of the current account position here only in the US, but other countries then improve, or other regions improve the current account position, obviously mainly because the imports are falling. And if the imports are falling, then then of course this is bad news for major exporters, for instance, for Germany. And then the projections for 2021, that looks and let's say back to normal. Only the US remains then at minus 2.6%, which I think is not so dramatic. Yeah, we can take a quick look at here reflections on per capita GDP. This is really an interesting story coming up from the US, or actually from the Council of Economic Advisors, who has published what I consider to be a somewhat strange report in 2018 on the opportunity cost of socialism. You can download the study from the website of the CEA. Okay, there is, let's say, a broader debate. We have immigration pressure from south to north. So what country's economic system and macrodynamics is best? And the Council of Economic Advisors suggests that's, of course, the United States. And it's not difficult to understand that socialism in Cuba and Venezuela, I mean, that's a real disaster, or in North Korea. But the Council of Economic Advisors then also compares the US development to Northern European countries, to Nordic countries, such as Sweden, Denmark, Norway, Finland, and so on. And that, I think, is very strange. And so the CA argues that the US per capita consumption in purchasing power parity is much higher than in Nordic countries. So roughly the US is ahead by about 30% of the Nordic countries. Okay, it's only 18% in the case of Norway, but I did show then in this book, The Global Trump, that here we should have some doubts. And the Council of Economic Advisors just looks at one year. So they look at 2016. While I'm looking at expected lifetime income or lifetime consumption. And if we do this, if we adequately account for the larger leisure time budget, which we have much more leisure time in Europe, certainly in Nordic countries as well, than in the US, well then this is an advantage which you have to take into account if you want to make a meaningful comparison. The European countries, the Nordic countries, have a higher life expectancy. So if we take a look at lifetime consumption, that of course is an advantage. And I already had mentioned that the US spends so much more on healthcare, but gets actually worse performance of the overall health indicators, and therefore we can obviously correct for the healthcare differential. And then the result is, okay, Norway is not 18% below the US figure, it's 2% ahead of the US. So here you can actually see the statistics in the Council of Economic Advisors. And so this table is from my book, The Global Trump. And if you follow the Council of Economic Advisors, you can, for instance, see that, okay, US equal to 100, and then Sweden is 32 points behind the US. But I think this is really a mistaken conjecture. It's a very strange perspective. It's a very inadequate, and I would say it's an incorrect perspective. So I then have also presented further data, which are then quite interesting, and you find all the details in the book: life expectancy, infant mortalities, hours worked, and so on. Okay, then we can stop here for this introduction.